All right, we are about to get started here. I'd like to welcome you all to another evening lecture with Fraunces Tavern Museum. Remember, if you're joining us virtually and you have any questions during the lecture, please leave them in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring the Q&A during the lecture, so don't worry about saving your question to the very end. If you are joining us in person, you will be able to ask your questions at the end of the lecture, and a book signing will follow the event as well. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. As always, please note that the views of the speakers are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York or its Fraunces Tavern Museum. And let me introduce tonight's speaker. Tommy Silk is a writer, photographer, and licensed New York City sightseeing guide. He has spent the last 5 years chronicling New York's landmarks on his Instagram page, Landmarks of NY. Today, he will be speaking to us about his new book, Hidden Landmarks of New York, a tour of the city's most overlooked buildings. And without further ado, I'm now going to turn it over to Tommy Silk.
Okay. Shift this over. Can everybody hear me? Cool. Welcome, and thanks for joining me. I'm so honored to be addressing Fraunces Tavern, one of my favorite buildings in New York City. Not trying to use brownie points here or anything like that, but no, genuinely, I've always loved Fraunces Tavern. I've attended multiple programs like this here, so the fact that I'm actually up here giving one is still shocking to me in the best way possible. So thank you so much for having me. Very much appreciate it. So as Melissa said, I wrote a book. It's called Hidden Landmarks of New York. And to describe this book, I sort of have to give you a little bit of background about myself, because this book and me are pretty intertwined. I started Landmarks of New York as an Instagram account about 5.5 years ago. This was an attempt by me to deal with a very, very bad job that made it very difficult to compartmentalize stress and realize, boy, do I need a hobby and do I need one quick. I've always loved history. I attribute that in part and parcel to growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut. Spoiler alert, I'm not a native New Yorker, unfortunately, but I like to think that I know a thing or two about New York. I grew up in Fairfield, Connecticut, which is not too much younger than New York City. It's only about 15 years younger. And similar to New York, growing up, I lived in a town that was full of colonial history, but didn't physically have much of it left. Fairfield was burnt down by the British during the Revolutionary War. There's only a handful of buildings that predate the Revolutionary War. As we'll see in tonight's lecture, a lot of the reasons why there's not many pre-revolutionary buildings left in New York City, spoiler alert, come from fires. So I've always had a bit of a sort of a kinship in the sense between these two places. My grandfather was a Washington Heights native. He was a history teacher for 45 years. We were best friends effectively for his life, and we constantly talked history because I was cool in high school. But he was so passionate about local history. When he moved from Washington Heights to Rockland County, he ended up being the Rockland County historian, and he really understood the term that all history is local. And when I moved to New York to, much like him, attend Fordham University, to just like him get a degree in history, with the same exact name as him, minus the last name. You're sensing a trend here. I sort of took that to heart. Now, it might just be me, but when I got interested specifically in New York City history, it seemed to me like when somebody thinks about New York, the history of it isn't really the first, second, third, or fifth thing that you think of. We have Boston, we have Philadelphia, we have plenty of cities on the Eastern Seaboard who are spoiled with a plethora of riches when it comes to the old buildings with the history. And it took until I was actually doing Landmarks of New York to finally put two and two together that New York is older than Boston or Philadelphia. So first of all, I will always take an opportunity to stick it to Boston. So here's one of them. And it bothered me in a way that we don't really, and again, this could be me projecting, but I don't feel like New York does. It's got so much other stuff going on that history is not the first thing that we think about. In 2018, I got my sightseeing tour license, which is there is a test you have to take. So, have some faith in what I'm about to tell you. It's also multiple choice, so do with that what you will. I was able to get 136 out of 150. I skipped the bus questions where they can idle because I was doing walking tours, so that should also give you some faith. But when I started doing walking tours of New York, I started with Lower Manhattan. I read a book called Island at the Center of the World by Russell Shorto. Yeah, right there we go. My favorite book about New York City, and I became instantly fascinated by Dutch New York, and that this 40-year brief window of history could have such an impact on the city that we live in today, the culture that we live in today, and even you can extrapolate if you read into Shorto's message, you can extrapolate into applying that to the United States in general. And so that really spurred me on wanting to find what's left, because there are some things that are left. It's just a whole lot harder to do that, but I find it a whole lot more rewarding when you do actually find these things compared to, you go up to Boston, the North End is, you walk up the North End or Beacon Hill, it's literally smacking you in the face with history. Here, you have to be a little bit more discerning. New York City also doesn't do itself any favors. I like to tell people that when it comes to looking for markers that something nearby is historical, in New York, look down, don't look up, because we go with paving stones. They're terrible. Like, you would have, how many of you have seen the old Stadthaus, the ruins underneath the building across the street from here? All right, for an audience like this, that is pretty low. And the point being is that if you go over there, you will see a window next to an oboe pan with a ruined foundation, with a plaque written in sand colored text, translucent over sand. And that is what's to tell you about what the heck that building was over there. So I took that personally. And when I had this terrible job, I decided that there had to be some way that I could just educate myself about the buildings of New York. And when I was working at this terrible job, I ended up trying to de-stress a little bit after work. I was working in Midtown East. I was living on the Upper East Side. So I would try to take a different route home every night. I'd just walk home. I wouldn't take the subway. And one night I'm walking home and I pass this building that has a plaque from the Landmarks Preservation Commission. And when I see that plaque, I finally stop. I'm like, all right, I'm going to read it this time. And it turns out that's the house that Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt lived in right after they got married. And that was kind of like a, lightning bulb moment for me right there. I was like, oh man, how many times have I walked past this building and didn't think twice about it? And I figured that if I'm thinking this, there might be a handful of people who might also be thinking this. So I had no idea how to do photography. I was working, like I said, at a tech company, and I hadn't written a historical paper since college when I got my degree in history. And I just decided I was going to try to track down as many landmark buildings as possible and try to write something new about one of them every day for as long as I could. And it's been 5.5 years at this point. I got lucky in a lot of ways. One of those ways was when I saw that plaque, I figured there had to be a centralized database. If Bloomberg was mayor and there was something that could be digitized, it was going to be digitized. And luckily for me, it was digitized. And the Landmarks Preservation Commission, which is what most of my research revolves around, has a map of all 5 boroughs with every single landmark building and historic district. There were, when I started, about 37,000. There are about 38,000 now. So I'm not running out of material anytime soon, thank God. And I just decided that I had this map, I had a camera, I had YouTube to tell me how to use said camera, and I just decided to start exploring my own city. And when I think about sort of historical education, so to speak, I feel like, unpopular opinion, I feel like we don't do it right. It's shocking, right? Because I feel like when I was studying history, what you generally talk about is, yeah, Coop. Uh, you generally talk about, okay, well, how did the Panic of 1815 influence grain prices? Like, you're all getting bored right now, right? Like, history is so much more than economics and politics and the military. I am very much quoting David McCullough when I'm saying this stuff. And he had a very good point where he said that history is everything. So when somebody tells me that, oh, I'm not interested in history, well, I'm like, well, are you not interested in anything in this world? Because at the end of the day, everything is historical. We at some point will become part of the pages of some future person's book who, hopefully mine will still be on a discount rack secondhand somewhere. But we're just all part of this larger timeline. And I find that really interesting because when it comes to finding and researching these buildings, especially for the book, it's called The Hidden Landmarks of New York. That wasn't my initial choice for a title. That was a publishing choice. But I took that as a way to sort of, okay, if we're going to take this universe of 38,000 buildings, how do we whittle them down to, initially they asked me for 100. And I said, okay, 100 buildings for all of New York. Could you give me any wiggle room? And they're like, we'll give you 120. Like, okay, I'll work with that. So when it came to actually choosing buildings for the book that were hidden, I knew that this was going to be a difficult task because when I give these tours, when I write these posts, like I said, this was something that I wrote for myself to further educate myself. What I've come to find is that the other people that this seems to resonate with particularly are other New Yorkers. When I give walking tours, it's rare if I have more than 2 people from out of the 5 boroughs. It's all people who want to know a little bit more about where they live, which is great. It's also a bit of a double-edged sword when you're going with the hidden moniker. And I'm sure here we have a handful of people who are like, yeah, that's not hidden. I'm like, fair. And I thought we might have something when when we released the type. This is the cover of the book if you haven't seen it. And when I first posted this on social media, I had people say to me, "Oh, that's the cover?" I'm like, "Yeah." Like, really, the Flatiron? That's pretty obvious. I'm like, okay, maybe not so off the mark. So when it came to actually physically constructing this book, I took hidden to mean quite a few things. When I started Landmarks of New York, the Roosevelt House wasn't hidden. It was literally right there. So I viewed it more as buildings that we might pass on a consistent basis. We're walking to work, you're walking to a restaurant, you're busy, you're New Yorkers. And that's the kind of building I wanted to focus on the ones that you've seen a million times and never thought twice about. And I always like to tell people, by all means, please look up. New York shouldn't be just for the tourists. We pay the taxes. We should be able to enjoy it. And that's where I sort of took the starting point. And initially what I thought I would do is be going off this idea that we're older than New York, we're older than Philadelphia, we're older than Boston. I thought, okay, we'll just go chronologically, right? We'll find the oldest building in New York and we'll just keep going forward and forward and forward. What I ended up finding with that is that the buildings that still exist from a long time ago tend to have similar stories. They tend to be built by the same types of people. They tend to be built by the same types of gendered people. So it got to a point where I'm like, the stories are all the same. So I don't know how many times I can talk about an 1820s style townhouse in the Village that was owned by a guy who owned a carting business. They all did that, and then they all did real estate development. Even though the buildings themselves are great, and again, I want to sort of show off that we have this deeper history, that wasn't it. So where I started to change my definition of hidden came to be, okay, let's talk about buildings that physically, yes, many people wouldn't end up seeing. And again, if a tourist picks up this book, I wouldn't be mad. So things that if you aren't coming into New York on a daily basis, you might not initially think about. Then I thought about the hidden stories behind these buildings. And we're going to talk about, we have a slideshow here. I love doing PowerPoints, hence my Midtown uniform. But we'll talk about some of these, specifically for this lecture. I wanted to focus on some of the actual older buildings and why a lot of them don't exist in Lower Manhattan anymore. But I wanted to talk about buildings that were older, but then I wanted to talk about, okay, if we need to flesh this out a little bit, how do we tell more complete stories that wouldn't have been told in a previous guidebook or something like that? What I tried to do is, when I finally found out I had 120 buildings to work with, I wrote down every single neighborhood I could think of off the top of my head. And then I was told, Queens, great. The Bronx, also great. I've been to Staten Island. And they have good stuff, but we need to focus on Brooklyn and Manhattan. So that kind of also helped me narrow things down a little bit. As much as I would love to do more of the outer boroughs, my publishers and are they're here, so talk to them and we'll get part 2 coming out. So I don't know how many times, Lisa, you guys have been actively lobbied for another book, but I'm blatantly going to do it. So anyway, the point was, so I looked at these neighborhoods. I had a list of neighborhoods. I had an average of how many buildings I could do per neighborhood. And again, like I said, I started with oldest buildings. Let's see what we have. And again, all the old buildings had very similar stories. So what I then decided to do is, okay, let's scrap the old buildings, not all of them, but let's scrap the idea of doing this chronologically. And let's try to find out how we can try through buildings show, a story of that neighborhood. And in doing so, I would usually try to find the oldest building. I would try to find buildings that were more recently landmarked. And the reason specifically why recency even matters with landmark buildings is that in the 1960s, when the Landmarks Preservation Commission came into existence, their mandate, apart from just cultural preservation, was the preservation of property values. And that is still part of their MO. If you go on their website and you see their charter, property values is part of the Landmarks Preservation Commission's actual mission. So what you end up finding is that when we start seeing the first landmarks in the 1960s, all the people who are making the decisions on landmarks look very similar to the people who own the buildings who built the buildings who are being landmarked. So what you see is that the oldest buildings in New York and the oldest historic districts, the oldest landmark buildings, tend to be a very specific story. And as you get a little bit further towards the present, that's when we start to see a little bit of diversification, looking for minority communities, looking for, the first Native American landmark just came into existence in 2021. It's on the South Shore of Staten Island. It's called Akawahung Manahanung. I practiced that so many times. It means island sheltered from the wind, historic site. And it is an archaeological site that was a seasonal village for the Munsee people for the better part of 8,000 years. And finding things like that, which I would say true hidden landmark, also help us remind ourselves that, if you talk to a European, which I do on occasion, they like to remind me, oh, my silverware is older than your country. I'm like, cool. Like, what do you want me to say to that? And then you have to remind them that, oh, by the way, before you sent us over here, there were still people and their history is still here. And it's interesting. That's one of the other challenges that a book like this presents, is that if I'm trying to tell the history of New York through buildings, you have to have a building effectively to be able to tell that story. So that is actually in the book. It's in the Staten Island section. So I'd highly recommend you take a look. And now, when you look at all those letters, how you pronounce it. So we're going with hidden stories. We're going with hidden in plain sight, let's call it, and hidden buildings. And I'm hoping that, New Yorkers will pick this up and they'll look through it and they'll flip through and they'll find a few buildings and they'll be like, what, the Dakota, really? Like, that's hidden? When I started doing a sneak preview before the book launched, I tried to basically get people to guess what the landmarks were. And because you are all such a learned audience, everybody was guessing them. And I'm like, okay, again, maybe I'm not as sneaky and clever as I thought. What struck me, though, is by the end of it, a woman who has been following me for the past 5.5 years, who does a lot of her own historical research, said, I got all of them but one. And when I heard the but one, I'm like, we got this. Okay. So the idea of this book is in a way, it's my love letter to New York, but it's my way of saying, I want this to feel like you have a friend in your pocket, just taking you around the city, pointing out things that you've seen on a daily basis, and just getting a little bit deeper. Now, I don't want to give myself too much credit. I wrote a picture book. So there's only so far that you can go when it comes to diving into that historical information. But my hope is that as you go through this and as you leaf through it, you don't have to read it front to back. That would be silly. Just find a picture that looks pretty and start reading from there. But I hope it kindles that curiosity, whether it's people who live in New York or even if it's people who don't live in New York and realize that, local history is everywhere and that you just need to look for it. That was kind of my goal for putting this together. So what I want to talk a little bit about now is why it's so difficult to find these older buildings in New York. I think a lot of us would immediately jump to redevelopment if we were thinking about why we don't have any history here. I can't believe I just said we don't have any history here. Why it doesn't seem like we have any history here. And that, for the most part, it's true to an extent, but there have been multiple events that have literally destroyed what has been here. So Fraunces Tavern is in the book. We'll talk a little bit more about the history of the building. But when it comes to Fraunces Tavern is the oldest structure left in Manhattan. There are some caveats. We will get into that. But that's from 1719. If you've read Island at the Center of the World, you'll know that the first Dutch colonists got here in 1624. There's a bit of a gap. So what happened? Sorry, too enthusiastic. What happened before that? When we look at Lower Manhattan as an example, so just for a little bit of background, the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, at its peak, extended to Wall Street, from the water to Wall Street. That's it. Also, Manhattan is now 25% larger than it was when the Dutch got here. So a lot of landfill. There is no single Dutch building left on Manhattan Island. There are traces, though. So where we're standing, we are on a lot on Pearl Street. Pearl Street used to be the water line of Manhattan. Some of you may know that the reference is because New York Harbor, before GE got its hands on it, had quite a few oysters in the harbor. The oysters were along the shoreline. The Dutch saw that, called it Pearl Street. They were really creative with naming things. They called Bridge Street, because guess what? Oh, there was a bridge. So that original city plan still exists. And that is the only thing sort of tangible from the Dutch period that still exists in Manhattan. I like to say that if you were to drop a Dutch person from 1650 into Manhattan today, once they got over the absolute whiplash of what the hell just happened to them, they'd be able to navigate at least from Pearl Street up to Wall Street. Now, the last Dutch building in Manhattan is going to be torn down in 1846. That is the last one. The reason why so many were gone by that point has everything to do with fires. There are going to be three major fires in New York City's history that are going to fundamentally reshape Lower Manhattan. The first one is in 1776. This is during the British takeover during the Revolutionary War. And I attended a wonderful program at Fraunces Tavern talking a little bit about how Washington messaged the burning of Manhattan. Because so many people, as soon as the city went up in flames, as Washington was retreating out of the city, fingers started to get pointing everywhere. And the Continentals point at the British and they say, well, clearly the British are burning down New York as retribution for them supporting us. The British are immediately pointing over at Washington. It's like, no, this guy did it. He didn't want us to take over New York. And Washington writes in his diary the night of the evacuation that, oh, the most fortuitous thing happened today. New York just happened to catch on fire. How lucky. And the program at Fraunces Tavern said, there's no smoking gun tied to Washington. But they did find letters between some of his top aides that made mention of, hey, we put in a newspaper that the Brits burned down New York and everybody's buying it. So just push that real hard. But anyway, whoever started the fire doesn't matter, because that's where that was a huge destroying force, mostly on the west side of the island. And that destroyed countless blocks, countless of these Dutch buildings that hadn't been torn down yet. And that was the first of three. Where we're standing now, if you go to Stone Street as an example, so Stone Street, another fun fact, Stone Street is the first paved street, very creatively named, in 1658. And Stone Street used to be a very, very well-to-do residential neighborhood. All of those buildings burnt down in the fire of 1835. So all the buildings that you see if you walk over to Stone Street are the replacements to those original Dutch buildings. Almost all of them date back to 1835, 1836. Those were built as warehouses after the opening of the Erie Canal, which made shipping much more necessary, warehouses and storage much more necessary down here. So that's fire number two. Fire number three, which gets us back to this Dutch building we're talking about, is 1845. Now, by 1845, things have gotten a little bit better for New York in that New York has already passed laws about wood buildings. You can't build out of wood anymore because fool me once, shame on me, or I'm about to say the way George W. Bush said it. But the point is, we had two fires. We had a third one. Like, let's not repeat the same mistakes of the past. So they had started switching a lot of buildings over to masonry, which is why it's so rare also to find wooden buildings in Lower Manhattan. Which is why, if there was an opportunity for me to include a wooden building in say the Village or anything like that, I wanted to include that, because that's a story that you might not necessarily think, okay, that's why this is here, that it's a holdover from a law. It got grandfathered in effectively. So by 1845, we had the last fire, and that's going to knock out pretty much the remaining Dutch buildings. The last Dutch building was 120 William Street. If you've seen it's that new apartment building. It's like very gray and dark with the arches. That's where it was. It was effectively used as a ship chandlery. They were making sails and other shipping related items there. So that basically gives me not a lot to work with when it comes to Lower Manhattan and finding some of these stories that I would like to compete with Boston and Philly on. So I thought we could go through and talk about some of the buildings from before the year 1800, because I can't even get buildings from before the Revolution apart from three, at least in Manhattan. I will point out the oldest building in New York City obviously still exists. It's for the oldest building, but it's in Brooklyn. It's called the Wyckoff House Museum. It's still open, dates back to about 1652. So that is firmly when the Dutch were in control. So keep that one in mind. It's also worth taking a visit in. I should also point out that when I was putting the book together, there are multiple Dutch-esque buildings. I thought about including all of them, but again, the stories are sort of the same. So if any of you are from or near Ridgewood, you're probably familiar with the Van Ende Onderdonk House. Again, similar story to the Wyckoff House, of things like that. That's why I left them out. But I thought, let's take a little virtual walking tour. If you see me start to walk backwards, that's just instinct for a tour guide. But I thought we'd take a quick look at some of the buildings down here, and just some of the buildings from before the year 1800 that we have in New York, in Manhattan specifically. All right, let me see if I can figure this thingy out. Hey, look at that. All right, when I give my walking tours, I love to bring up the James Watson House, because I love to point out the church right here. And I start the tour off, and I'm like, okay, who wants to let's guess some centuries here. I'll be like, all right, who thinks this is from the 1600s? Usually nobody raises their hand. Who thinks it's from the 1700s? A lot of people raise their hands. More for the 1800s. I'm like, you guys are all close. It was 1962. And that church was basically infill. So the original houses that we're going to talk about are actually these two right here. So these are just around the corner on Water Street. They were combined into one house. So these are the two individual houses that we used to have. So James Watson lived in this portion right here. So this is the oldest portion. That is from 1793. I think it's a great striking visual reminder of what New York looked like in the 1790s, literally wedged between these skyscrapers. So as out of place as these are today, they were very much in place. And to try to change your mindset to that is just mind-boggling to me. These tend to be very popular with ship captains, because it was effectively a 18th century work from home situation. You got yourself a nice little parlor up there. Your ships are right across the way from you, so you can watch all the poor sailors, putting the stuff in your boat, and then when you're ready to go, just walk across the street. But James Watson, the guy who lived in this house originally, was a Federalist. He was the Speaker of the New York State Assembly, so he had that one built for him in 1793. Interestingly enough, it was also designed by a guy, or it's attributed to the design at least, to a gentleman by the name of John McComb Jr. John McComb Jr. is one of the earliest American trained architects. He was the co-designer of the current New York City Hall. That is sort of his biggest piece of work, but he is responsible for building that house. Now, the one to the right over there, that goes up in 1806. And the reason why these buildings still exist is that when we start to see the first waves of immigration to New York City, en masse immigration, so specifically the Germans and the Irish, Ellis Island isn't going to open until the 1890s. Most, if you have family who are Irish immigrants who came to New York, especially around the famine, more often than not, they were processed in Castle William, just around the corner in Battery Park, which was referred to as Castle Gardens or Castle Island, depending on what period in time they came through. Because you had such a huge influx of Irish, and specifically single Irish women, the Catholic Church opened up a place for those women to basically live as they were integrating into New York society. And the other crucial thing is that this was home for a few years to the woman who would go on to become the first American-born Catholic saint, and that is Elizabeth Seton. So if any Seton Hall grads here, you just lost to Fordham. I just like to throw that one out there. But that was founded by her nephew and named in her honor because it was an all-guys school, but it was named after a nun. But anyway, the Setons lived here from 1801 to 1803. I like to describe her situation as she was married to a 18th century crypto bro. A lot of boom and busts going on with this guy when it came to business. So Seton grew up in a very well-to-do New York family, and her husband, like I mentioned, was a businessman who really had a lot of make or break moments, and sometimes he broke. When he was particularly broke, they had to move out of a very nice house, and they lived here for a few years. Seton would eventually follow her husband to Italy because he had some health concerns, particularly tuberculosis, which is not fun back in the day. So they did what any good, well-to-do family would do: is they listened to their doctor's advice that said, "Go to Italy and breathe some fresh air. You'll be fine." So they go over to Italy, breathe some fresh air, and he promptly dies. And that is where Elizabeth is taken in by his Italian business partners and ends up converting to Catholicism. So when she comes back to New York, she's an absolute pariah because 1801 for New York, ooh, not good time to be Catholic. It's going to take basically 100 years for it to be moderately okay. And she eventually will move to Baltimore. But by the time we get to the 1960s, the landmarking process, the Diocese of New York had purchased this to build the church because she had been canonized as a saint. So basically, they survived long enough for the church to end up buying them. Then they got landmarked. And then that's why they also put in this very, very timely, I mean, having grown up Catholic, I'm sure a few of you have here, 1960s, not our best decade for church design. Not too shabby. It doesn't look like an alien pavilion was dropped down into the World's Fair. So I'm pretty impressed with that. But this is just one of those examples of, these are two brick buildings. And in the span of what? We just talked for 2.5 minutes or so. No, I ramble, but 5, let's call it. There's all that just in those two little buildings. So that's, hopefully I'm articulating the way I did in the book, but like that's what gets me going. That is the passion that I have for this, because these are things that I think a lot of people who come on my Lower Manhattan walking tour, if they don't live in the city, they've worked down in the financial district, and I've literally had them tell me I've walked past these buildings so many times, and not once for the life of me did I think on my way to 55 Water Street that this could have been a place from the 1700s. And that's what I wanted to really, really dig into. All right, let's go to the home field here. There we go. I think everybody recognizes this one. So Fraunces Tavern. Fraunces is interesting on so many levels, even if you take out Samuel Fraunces, which obviously big portion of it revolves around him. This is one of those things where, again, Fraunces Tavern is not hidden for New Yorkers. It might be hidden if you've come to New York, 2 or 3 times, you stuck around in Midtown. But the families, the people that have been involved in this building stretch just so deep into the fundamental ties of New York. So what we're standing on right now, I mentioned that Pearl Street was the shoreline, right? We're on the other side of Pearl Street. So we'd be swimming in 1609. Pearl Street eventually gets filled in, and there was the ability to purchase discounted lots of land specifically at the low tide mark. So if you owned land on Pearl Street, the Dutch and later the English governments would encourage you to buy these very discounted pieces of land that extended into the water, with the thought process being that you were going to fill that land in. And in that way, you can have private citizens effectively expanding the landmass of Manhattan. So the family that does this is the Van Cortlandt family. So Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx, that's the Van Cortlandts that we're talking about. So specifically, a guy by the name of Stephanus Van Cortlandt, which is a heck of a name. Stephanus probably was college educated, because back then, if you would use the Latinized version of your name. So Peter Stuyvesant, the last director general of New Amsterdam, he went by Petrus Stuyvesant because he wanted to show off to all of his friends that he was fancy and he was educated. So in case anybody wants to bring that back, start brushing up on whatever your Latin name is, and you can start doing that. So Van Cortlandt acquires this plot of land, and by 1719, it's going to be acquired by his son-in-law. And his son-in-law is a guy by the name, he went by Etienne because he was French, but most people called him Stephen. So we have two Stephens who don't want to be called Stephen. And Etienne Delancey. And that is the Delancey family of Delancey Street. So you can already see we're starting to tie in all these things. You're like, oh, wait, I know about that. He's going to be the one who actually builds this as a house in 1719. What we end up having, though, is we don't know if the Delancey family actually ended up living here. So he married into the Van Cortlandt family. I forgot to mention that part, and that's why he gets the plot of land. But he builds the house. By 1762, that's when we're going to have Samuel Fraunces acquire the property. And he's going to convert it at that time into something called the Queen's Head Tavern. Now, Fraunces was a staunch revolutionary, as you might get a sense from everything in here. And when he opened up the tavern prior to the British occupation, there was a lot of interaction between him and the Continental Army and its staff going back and forth trying to defend Brooklyn before the British took over in 1776. He ends up fleeing the city during the occupation of New York. He leaves the building to his son-in-law, who was a loyalist. There are some rumors that he might have been a spy. The AMC series Turn was based on the alleged spy ring that operated out of Fraunces Tavern. And by the end of the war, Samuel Fraunces comes back. He reacquires this property, and where it gets sort of its famous aura from, so to speak, is the fact that when the British evacuate in November of 1783, so we're almost, I think it's November 23rd, so happy almost evacuation day, everybody. 1783, there is a lot of negotiation that is going on between the surrendered British and the Americans as to how they're going to evacuate the city of New York. New York is the last city that the British are going to occupy during the war. So the negotiations take place in this building. Not only that, but the celebration, the Americans ended up hosting a dinner for their counterparts, the British counterparts here, and they hosted it in this room, or not in this room, sorry, in that building. George Washington is going to march his troops down Broadway. They're going to be having a grand old time celebrating, and eventually, what I think the most famous story about Fraunces Tavern is that Washington is eventually going to effectively retire from the military in the long room on the second floor. Fast forward a few years, he is going to get pulled out of retirement, called off the bench to become president, and that is when New York is the capital of the United States. Many different departments of the new federal government under the Constitution are going to meet at Fraunces Tavern. Samuel Fraunces is eventually going to be tapped to actually run the executive household at the first executive mansion, which is where the Brooklyn Bridge is now. If anybody, I'm sure, is going to ask me questions later, if there's a building I could bring back, would love to have that one back. There's a plaque that is very difficult to find where it was located. The easiest way to find it is literally by putting its latitude and longitude coordinates in and looking really hard. Anyway, so Fraunces Tavern is interesting because it leads to a interesting question about historic preservation, which is, over the years, I mentioned that there are many fires. Fraunces is generally spared from the major fires, but it's still going to experience multiple fires on the interior and exterior. So what happens is, after every fire, whoever is owning the building is going to rebuild and slightly modernize the place. What we're looking at now dates back to about 1907. And the reason why this is at any point, not controversial, but the reason why this is sort of difficult to say, 1719, is we don't know if this is what it looked like, because the earliest photo, I believe, or not photo, the earliest drawing of it, I believe, is from 1854. So the reason why this is even a question is, we had like many of these historic buildings, I've had people ask me, so how many of these almost got the axe? The answer is pretty much all of them. Fraunces is not an exception to that rule. In 1900, there was a threat that the building was going to be torn down. It was the Daughters of the American Revolution sort of took the initiative to try to save the building. The owners of the building didn't want to sell it to them. So eventually, the US government is actually used eminent domain on the building and classify it as a national park. They are then going to sell that to the Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York, who are the current owners of the building. And that's happening in 1900. By 1907, they hire an architect from Staten Island, a guy named William Morceau. And they tell him basically, we've had so many different restorations. We had multiple stories added on top. So I think it was about 5 stories at its peak. We want to bring it back to what its original design was. And I mentioned before, the earliest image of it we have is from 1854. So he basically did his homework, and he did his best guess. So what he did is he compared this with other mansions at the time that are contemporaries with this. So the Van Cortlandt Manors, the Van Cortlandts are coming right back into this. The Van Cortlandt Manor in the Bronx, roughly a little bit newer, but still same style that we think Fraunces was built as. Same with the Phillipsey Manor up in Yonkers. And when he started removing the upper floors that had been added on, he was able to find the original roof line. And taking the roof line and peeling back those layers, he was able to come up with this. So there's a good chance it looked like this in 1719. It's just not, we don't know for sure. Now, there are original pieces to the building. So there are original brickwork on the outside. There are original floorboards on the inside. There's original plaster. It's sort of a ship of Theseus situation. If you replace every single board in a ship, is it still the same ship? Well, I'd say this is the pub of Theseus, except they have a little bit more going for them than all the pieces being replaced. So I will say it's from 1719. I just like to make the caveat that so much has been done that, that's the thing with buildings. They are living history as much as anything else is. So even though it is highly modified and highly revised, the stuff still happened here. And that's what matters at the end of the day. The buildings don't matter at all. I mean, they do a little bit, but the whole point of it is the people behind the buildings are what make it interesting. Otherwise, I'd be telling you about, like, okay, look at the lintels above. Well, they don't have any lintels, but like, look at the sashes and the windows, like the architectural features, but it's the people behind them that make these things so interesting. And that's what drew me to this actual, to coming up with these buildings for the book. Normally on the tours, I'm like, any questions? But I forgot we have a Q&A at the end, so hold that thought. All right. So the Captain Joseph Rose house, you might not know, but there are actually a handful of buildings in the seaport that still date back to before the year 1700. Again, when I was determining what to actually include in the book, there were a few of them from around the same time period that I could have chosen from. This one by far and away has the best story. So Joseph Rose builds this house, sometime between 1773 and 1781, which could make it arguably the third oldest building left in Manhattan, or the fourth, depending on where you rank Fraunces in there. Now, Joseph Rose made his money, as one does in the Honduran mahogany trade, and he ended up building this house. But it's the interesting stuff is way less about Joseph Rose and what happened afterwards. So I have to explain to people that, especially newer people who have arrived to New York, port cities are interesting because everyone's like, well, why isn't the water, like, why do they build such ugly stuff by the waterfront? It's like, because people didn't want to live by the waterfront because there were the docks and there was shipping, and it was a pretty ugly, gross place to live. It'd only be really until the 21st or the 20th century that you start to see the revitalization of these as like a natural place to spend time. So if you were renting a house down here, and Joseph Rose rented out his house, you might be a dock worker, you might be a sailor, you might end up being in a sort of rough and tumble neighborhood. And this is no exception. Anybody know what rat baiting is? I hope you don't. I would very much question myself if you did. So rat baiting is something that occurred in this house, and it was an illicit form of gambling where in the basement you would have a couple terriers, and you'd have them in a pen, and you'd throw rats in there, and you would bet on how many rats your dog would kill. Yay, New York. That happened in this building. So that was something that was happening throughout the seaport, but this one is one that we have pretty good evidence that it actually happened there. So when I was thinking about putting this in the book versus another building from, the 1790s, I was like, this might be a little bit more interesting, but that might just be me. Anyway, no real easy way to transition from that, and it's not going to be easy because the next one's not much better. Anybody remember the Bridge Cafe? Yeah, it's too bad. RIP. Closed in 2012. Hurricane Sandy just demolished it. They had 5 feet of water in the basement, I think. But this is one of the few wooden buildings left in Lower Manhattan. I think it is actually the only wooden building, to my knowledge, left in Lower Manhattan. And this one, when we say built in 1794, that's again an estimate because it's not exactly clear when it was built. But for a period of time, there was a bar here called Hole in the Wall. And one of the stories behind that was apparently there was a particularly rough barmaid who ran the bar. And if there were fights, somebody might pull a Vincent van Gogh and lose an ear, and she had a jar of them in the bar to warn future patrons, if you mess with her, you won't hear as good the next day. So yeah, so not, believe me, not all of these are so illicit. So, but these are just some of the stories that I wanted to include in here. All right, now this one a little bit better, and I think we're running up on questions relatively soon, so we're just gonna go through as many of these as we can. But this one I think is absolutely fascinating because this is up in the East Village. This is actually right across from St. Mark's and the Bowery Church, and this has a connection back to the Stuyvesant family. So again, for those of you who didn't know, Peter Stuyvesant, he's the last Dutch governor of New Amsterdam before the British take over. Even though Stuyvesant is defeated in a way, he ends up coming back to New York, and he ends up living on his farm. His farm was in the East Village. It was the farm of the direct that was specifically given to the director of the Dutch West India Company in New Amsterdam. Farms at the time were referred to as Boweries. The road, the Bowery, leads up to where Stuyvesant's farm was, and it leads up to where St. Mark's and the Bowery is. So the Stuyvesant family stayed in there, and his great 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 grandson was the one who ended up building this house in 1795. And this is pretty much unchanged from 1795. I think that's fascinating, mostly because if you look over here, like this doesn't look any different than a townhouse from almost 60 years later. So that this is a hidden in plain sight, bar none. It's one of the longest continuously occupied residential homes in the entire city. I think it was for sale semi recently. So if you go on Street Easy, you can see some interior pics. There are some original pieces of the interior as well. Apparently, and I'm no architectural historian here, I've learned that these reverse trapezoid lintels up here are very indicative of the 1790s. So go figure. I guess people like reverse trapezoids. Anyway, but it was his. So this was the Stuyvesant family, in addition to building this house, donated the land for St. Mark's and the Bowery, and that's where the Stuyvesant family are buried, including Peter Stuyvesant. So if you ever go into that churchyard, you will see a very, very scary statue of a guy with a peg leg, but he doesn't have the peg leg in the statue, just kind of judging you as only a Calvinist could. So, but this is one of the oldest buildings as you get further up the island. And that's one of the things you'll notice is that as you work your way further up Manhattan, it's a really, really easy history to trace because the old stuff starts low and then it works its way slowly up and up and up and up. How much time do we have left? One more? All right, we got one more. Okay, this is a great one. So this is the oldest house in the village, and this is known as the Isaacs Hendricks house. So construction was started in 1799. It just hit the cutoff for before 1800. I think it was finished in 1800, but is what it is. So the Isaacs family were the ones that built it, and they immediately defaulted to their creditors. So they lost it, and it was bought by their son-in-law, Harmon Hendricks. Now the Hendricks family actually tie back in a very close to Fraunces Tavern because they were members of Shearith Israel, which was the first temple synagogue congregation in New York City, which dates back to the 1650s. The synagogue was founded by a group of Sephardic Jews fleeing first from Spain and Portugal. They're fleeing the Inquisition. They end up making it to Dutch-held Brazil. The Dutch lose because they're not speaking Dutch in Brazil anymore. They're speaking Portuguese, and all of a sudden, oh hey, the Inquisition's back. They flee on a ship and they end up in New Amsterdam harbor. Stuyvesant, being the son of a Calvinist minister, is like, no, you're not coming in. And they're like, you should let us in. So they actually petitioned the Dutch government, which overrules Stuyvesant, telling them not to come in, and also helps fundamentally make New York a place that is first and foremost a commercial hub, not a religious experiment. And that is very clearly written in the letter back to Stuyvesant telling him to get over it effectively. So the Hendricks family, they were members of Shearith Israel. They also were copper merchants, and they actually had some connection with Paul Revere as a supplier for them. And they were very active in the Jewish community in New York City. And that's one of those stories where I also like to highlight, you can get the history of communities like this through some of these buildings that you wouldn't necessarily think of. And I think a lot of people are very surprised when I tell them that the first Jewish immigrants arrived in New York in the 1650s. And that seems to bother quite a few racists, which makes me feel good at the end of the day. Now, the house itself is, like I said, started in 1799. It was refaced in the 1830s and then had another restoration in the 1920s. So it probably would have had some dormer windows up here rather than this full-blown attic right there, it was also wooden when it was built. And they probably got wind of all the fires and they're like, yeah, we're going to spruce this place up a little bit, make sure it's a little less burnable. And even though this isn't one of the older buildings, I do like to point out this right here is 75.5 Grove Street. Has anybody ever seen this? Yeah, so this is the narrowest building in Manhattan at 9.5 feet. That was built by the son-in-law of one of the Hendricks families who asked if they could build the house on the driveway. And that's how we have a 9.5 foot wide house that also retailed for over $4 million with a Murphy bed. I don't have the issue of what to do with $4 million. I think I could do a little bit better, but that's just me. So I hope as you go through this book, you sort of appreciate effectively what I appreciated of finding sort of these not just these older buildings, but how buildings can take on some of the stories of the people who interacted with them. It didn't have to be the person who built it, doesn't have to be the single occupant who lived there, but you can just tell. I mean, at a certain point, like I mentioned at the beginning of this, this will happen to somebody here. Future history book will mention, oh, this building on Broadway, oh, so and so lived there. Like it's just a continuation. We're just part of this much larger story, and I find it absolutely fascinating to basically uncover people who are just like you and me, who just happened to live a few hundred years ago. So with that, I will open the floor to questions.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. On YouTube, there's a video by a real estate broker showing a home owned by Eleanor Roosevelt and supposedly up for sale. Have you seen that?
I haven't. Do you know where it is?
It's in Manhattan.
Do you know where in Manhattan it is?
No, but if you go on,
I'll look it up. Okay. Well, that might be a future.
It goes through the house room by room.
That might be a future video for me. Stay tuned.
And we'll just ask for you to quickly repeat the question.
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry.
For our Zoom audience.
Sorry, Zoom audience.
The Jamel Mansion claims to be sort of the oldest
Yes.
house in Manhattan. How much of that is budget, or is there other provisos?
We're in Fraunces Tavern. So that would be who it could potentially beat out. That's effectively what. So sorry, also for the Zoom people. The question was the Morris Jamel Mansion, which was built in I think 1766, off the top of my head, or 65, claims to be the oldest residential building in Manhattan. I mean, the building itself pretty much the same. The grounds are exactly the same as when it was built. So it kind of depends on how you feel about Fraunces Tavern. If this is still original enough in your mind for it to be the oldest home in New York, or do you prefer to go with something slightly less unaltered? That would have been one of the slides if we kept going forward, but it's kind of personal preference at this point. But there is a lot that is very much original in that house. Fun fact about the Morris Jamel Mansion real quick. You might know about it because Aaron Burr lived there very briefly. He ended up marrying into the Jamel family. He ended up getting divorced within 4 months because he basically bankrupted the Jamel family who owned the house. And if you want a little poetic justice, the lawyer that his wife used to divorce him, Alexander Hamilton Jr.
Slide at that house?
Yeah, sure. Let me see. Oh, there it is. How about that? And Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote portions of Hamilton while sitting in the house. He wanted to get sort of in the vibe of the Hamilton era, so he went up to Aaron Burr's 4-month abode.
Wow. Other questions from the room?
Hi, if you could go back to the previous slide, I'm curious what the boarded up side.
Are these things right here?
Yeah.
I've been asked that multiple times. I've not found a good answer. I have a guess, but it's only a guess. My guess is that there were chimneys over there. And I think at some point those hearths might have been removed. Maybe when they started putting in the sidewalks, maybe in the 1920s when they did that. I don't know why you would get rid of a fireplace. And I haven't seen the inside, so I don't know what's on the other side. But it looks consistent with where a fireplace would have been. But again, that is only my personal speculation here.
But is it brick in those spaces, or is it board?
I don't know what's on the other side.
It's brick.
They rebuilt it as brick, but I don't know, like on the inside, if you, are you still,
I'm asking about the outside. That's not board, that's brick.
it's brick. Yeah, it used to be board and then they rebuilt it as brick, but I don't know if those could have been originally brick as well. I don't know.
Just let me quick run my microphone around.
Thank you.
Wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Of the 120 that are in the book, you were just mentioning how you haven't been inside this one. Of the 120, how many have you been inside, and how many were relegated to just viewing
Yeah.
from the exterior?
So for the Zoom audience, the question is how many of these buildings have been inside? The answer is very few. Many of them are still private homes. So unless they're willing to let me in, and unless I would knock on the door, which I'm outgoing, but not that outgoing, I haven't been able to really yet. I think the other thing too is that when it comes to landmarking buildings in New York, for the most part, it's just the exterior of the building anyway. Now, there are buildings that I have been inside where the interior is also landmarked. They're much fewer and far between. There's only about, I think, like 60 of them. They're about, it's under 100. Those are the ones that I've tried to go in first. I still haven't been inside the Woolworth building, which is one of them. They make it very difficult. Can you get me in? We'll talk later. Okay. But those are the types of places I'd probably start with. And then if anybody has homes that are, somewhat similar on the interior, like, the Wyckoff house was closed when I went there. I definitely want to go back in there. I want to go to the Van Onderdonk house in Ridgewood, which is from 1709, old Dutch style farmhouse. I did get permission. Do I have it in here? I did get to go inside. Let's see. Wyckoff house. So I did get to go inside the Friends Meeting House in Queens. So this is the oldest house of worship in New York City. It was Friends Meeting House. It's Quaker, still an active congregation. It is fascinating, and that deserves its own talk about it. But effectively, for those of you who don't know, the Flushing was founded during the Dutch colonial period, mostly by English Quakers, and they built this building after the English occupation. But a lot of the Quakers, because they were living on the water, worked in like building ships. So a lot of the interior architecture, the structural supports are very similar with what you would find in the inside of like a sailing ship or something like that. So some of these definitely, like, that adds to the story, as opposed to, if that house in the Village, the Isaac Centric's house, it could be completely modern on the inside. Don't know.
I'm going to give us a question from our online audience who asks, is Mount Vernon Hotel in Manhattan in the book?
It is not. I thought about it. So the Mount Vernon Hotel is also a pre 1700s building. It was a stable for a while that was owned by Abigail Adams Smith, the daughter of John Adams, second president of the United States, and her husband. He went broke. They lost that. It turned into a hotel. It's is it the headquarters of the Colonial Dames? It's something like that. I thought about that one. I didn't include that one because we also need landmarks for potential future books. So I figured that the story of that building, we could cover it, not cover that story, but cover similar stories like that through some of the other buildings, which freed up different ones for me to explore. Again, very, very tough to narrow 38,000 down to 120.
Do we have one final question from the room?
Do you have a favorite building that you uncovered during your research, or one that like caught you off guard, or just you were most surprised about?
So the question is there are you asking for my favorite or the one I was most interested in when I most interested in both? Okay, we'll start simple. Favorite one, Little Red Lighthouse. Boom, easy. Most interested, there are a couple of them. I think so two in particular that are fascinating are both in Brooklyn. There's one in Williamsburg, which was a former segregated school in Brooklyn. It was called Colored School Number 3. And it was an example of how, I think that's one of the other things that we sort of, at least, I mean, having grown up in Connecticut, going and being taught in public schools in Connecticut, you're taught that, the North's the good guy. we were, we fought, we were the good guys in the Civil War. We, the South was racist. We're, not us, right? And it's a very good indication that absolutely not. History is a whole lot more complicated than that. That one is in the book. It's also really interesting because there was also some pushback by families who were worried that if they actually integrated the school, their level of education would decline. Also, Weeksville, which was the largest free Black community in New York prior to the Civil War. It was one of the largest free Black communities in the United States. There are 4 houses left in Crown Heights that they rediscovered the sort of significance of them years later. They were just kind of hanging out in this alleyway in Crown Heights, and an aerial surveyor realized that they actually were oriented along this diagonal road called Hunterfly Road, which is what the most of the town was based around. And the Weeksville Heritage Center has done an amazing job showing what life would have been like in these buildings throughout various decades, throughout the 1830s to the 1950s or so. And it's one of those other fascinating things because it shows a community that was banding together to fight against oppression. And it was also interesting because it was so vitally important when New York finally abolishes slavery. If you were a Black man, you were required to have property to vote. That wasn't the case with white families, with white men. You didn't need property for that. So Weeksville ended up being an excellent place where Black families could buy property at an affordable price, and they could buy in a safe neighborhood. After the draft riots in 1863, you're going to see a large influx of people from Manhattan fleeing that kind of destruction. And it was a very important place that took a large part in the Underground Railroad and all that stuff. It's well worth a visit. But those were 2 that I had heard of, but hadn't really looked into yet, and then getting to research them was a privilege, and I'm glad I was able to include in the books.
Great. I'm going to start our closing announcements then so that we save time for book signing. Just usurp right up there. All right. Thank you, Tommy, for that fantastic presentation. And thank everyone here for joining us tonight as well. If you enjoyed tonight's lecture and would like to stay up to date with all of our programs here at Fraunces Tavern Museum, you can join our mailing list by going to frauncestavernmuseum.org. That's also where you can find our calendar of upcoming programs. Our next lecture will be on Monday, December 9th. You can also check our calendar for the upcoming reenactment of Washington's farewell to his officers and other new events. Thank you to those of you who have also donated to the museum. Your generous support helps us fulfill our mission and share the history of the American Revolutionary era with the public. If you would like to donate, you can also do that on our website, frauncestavernmuseum.org. And thank you again for joining us at another Fraunces Tavern Museum lecture. We hope to see you all again soon. The book signing will be right in the gallery with the cookies. You can't miss it. So we've got a chair for you at the table. We'll be sort of selling books and all that simultaneously. So
Is it good?
great. Thank you.